Hello, I'm Torvald Thorgarson, and I've decided to do a very brief and abbreviated lesson drawn from my How to Do Research in the Sagas class. So this is again going to be brief and abbreviated. All I am doing is trying to give you a few things to think about, some tips on ways to do research in the sagas, and avoid a few of the very easy mistakes to make. When you're doing the research, it's important to understand sometimes context of the culture as to what you're reading, as opposed to simply taking what you see at face value. And I'm going to give you some very graphic examples of what I mean by that. I break the sagas up into two very broad general categories. Again, these are broad, they are generalized, they are not specific. And those categories are the Royal Sagas and the Family Sagas. The Royal Sagas are exactly what they sound like. They deal with the kings, the jarls, the royal families, and a good example of that would be the Rolf Krake saga or even the Beowulf saga. Yes, I know the Beowulf saga is not Norse, it is Anglo-Saxon, right? But the cultures are very similar, as well as my personal belief that the story of Beowulf was Norse in origin, but that's an entirely different class. However, they do share a couple of things, and that is when you're looking at a royal saga, the royal saga often reads very much like a modern fantasy novel. And that is especially true in the two that I just mentioned, the Rolf Krake saga and the Beowulf saga. We've got gods, we've got heroes, we've got monsters, we've got magic weapons, we have people casting spells and using rune magic. And so the thing to remember about the royal sagas is that in many cases, the person that the saga is about is looking for a skald to help reinforce that family, that royal family's standing in the eyes of other Norse people as being special. And often that means that they are related in some way to one or more of the Norse gods. Most often when you're talking about a king or a jarl, they're trying to associate themselves with Odin. So it's not that there aren't bits of real Norse culture in a royal saga, but everything is so exaggerated that for me, the thing to remember is that the royal saga is about inspiration and aspiring to be like those great heroes and the kings and the jarls and the nobles. Every Norseman wants to believe that they can be blessed in some way by Odin or Tyr or Thor and pick up a magic sword and go slay a dragon, right? So we, modern people, think of our heroes, Superman and Batman and Iron Man and all of the various heroes of our modern mythology, and we want to be like them. Well, the Norse felt the same way, and the royal sagas were where a lot of that plays out. Now, when it comes to the family sagas, that is a very different thing entirely. We're talking about the Icelandic sagas, things like Njal's saga and Egil's saga. These are family sagas, and they deal with the average everyday person much more than the royal sagas do. So it's not that I think you should not use the royal sagas in your research, but it depends on the focus of your research. If what you're trying to learn is mostly about the culture of the typical Norse person, you're better off doing your research in the family sagas. If you're looking for motivation and inspiration of the Norse, then that's where I think the Royal Sagas are a little better. Now, I mentioned about taking things at face value and having to understand context and culture to avoid making a mistake in interpretation. And so I'm going to give you a very graphic, visual example of that. So let's say that you're reading in one of the family sagas. Some of you who've already done some research in the sagas will probably recognize who I'm about to talk to, but I'm not naming any names. But we have a great hero, and this hero is known for having a magical sword, a very powerful, ancient heirloom, as the skalds will call it. And it has all sorts of magical properties that give him an edge in battle. However, the saga makes a big deal out of saying that unless he is engaged in a duel with another Norseman, or in very specific circumstances, when he goes to war, he leaves it behind. And instead, he goes to battle using a sax. And this is where the context and interpretation come in. So let me give you a graphic example of why. When we think of sax, we think of knife, right? Saxons, the people of the knife. Everybody and his cousin had a sax. If you were a Norseman, man or woman, you carried a sax. Adult, child, you carried a sax, right? You needed one for everyday work around whatever it is you did for a living. Whether you were a farmer or a fisherman or a craftsman, you needed to have a sax around. For the nobles and the royalty, you still needed to have a sax around. Saxes were used for eating, they were used for cutting leather, they were used for carving wood. Everybody carried a sax, right? And so when we think of sax, we think of things like this, right? This is your typical belt sax, utility sax, right? A little small, don't you think? This is also a sax. And that is really tiny, isn't it? We have examples of some that are even smaller than this. These are also saxes. So, let me ask you, if you are going into battle, are you going to carry this? Or are you going to carry this? You know what? I may be a great damn hero, but I am not going to handicap myself going into battle using this little dinky thing here. Alright, that's what this is for. This is a fighting sax. This doesn't have a lot of applications beyond hitting somebody with it. It's a little long for your standard everyday use around the farm. Okay? Now, we modern people, we love to categorize things. And so we talk about broadswords and long swords and short swords. But when then it comes to saxes, we see the word sax in the saga, and we immediately think, and that's just not correct interpretation. We have to think like a Norse person, right? The Norse person who is hearing this story already knows when the skald says that this hero took his sax to battle, that what he's taking is a fighting sax. And we know in a description, if somebody pulls a sax off his belt to eat at the feast that night, that he's pulling out one of the smaller utility saxes. And when we see in a story the skald telling us that the Norseman pulls out a sack to carve a spoon, we again know what size sax he's pulling out. The sagas don't say he pulls out a belt sax and he pulls out a tooling sax and he pulls out a fighting sax. It just says sax because we as Norse people growing up in that culture already understand from context what type of sax that person is pulling out to use. Okay? So another thing is, when you're reading in the sagas and you come across something, even in a family saga, not a royal saga now, a family saga, and you see a reference to something that you think sounds a little fantastical, doesn't quite sound like something that you would think the average everyday Norseman would do, that you think somebody is exaggerating and boasting. And of course, exaggerating and boasting was a very common thing among the Norse. It was actually expected. You get a good example of that in the Beowulf Royal Saga, when Beowulf is talking about swimming with 30 coats of mail on. We all know that that's bloody impossible. But exaggeration and boasting and bragging are a common theme among the Norse. But let me give you a graphic example of something that sounds a bit fantastical on the outside, but we have a way of verifying that it's very likely to be a real thing that the Norse engaged in, and that's oar dancing. Now, for those of you who have never heard the term and don't understand what oar dancing is, let me draw a picture for you. You have a long ship. It's got, say, 20 oars on either side. And somebody wanting to show off has all of the oarsmen just hold the oars in place. And he goes and he jumps out of the back of the boat. He lands on the oars. He runs up the side of the boat. He jumps in the front of the boat. He jumps off the other side of the boat, lands on the oars, runs down the side of the boat, and jumps back in again. All without falling off into the water. It really does sound like something you expect a modern person to say, here, hold my beer and watch this, right? Well, here's the thing. When you're doing research in a saga and you come across something like that, this is a good time to take notes. Write down what it is that you think may not be real, that it might be an exaggeration or a boast or a brag. Something that the skald has thrown into a story to try and make it more entertaining. Write it down. Write down the saga. Write down where in the saga you found the information. This has been one of my biggest personal mistakes through the years, is that all too often when I'm reading a saga, I'm reading it just like I read a modern novel, and I don't bother taking notes. And so I'm having to do a lot of backtracking now to try and find certain references that it's information I know and it's information I have verified. However, I never wrote any of it down. So don't be like me. Don't be like Torvald and have to backtrack. So at any rate, you write it all down. And then when you read in other sagas and you come across that same reference, aha, now you've got corroboration. And in general, we of the Society for Creative Anachronism would like to see at least 3 examples of whatever it is. And here's the thing, sometimes the examples don't have to necessarily agree with each other. We just want to see a reference to that particular thing in 3 different sources. So if you find another reference in the same saga, that doesn't count. You got to find it in a different source, either another saga or in the chronicles or histories of another people nearby to the Norse. So again, you want corroboration across different sagas or different source material. So there are a lot of these types of things that come up, but those are 2 just really quick graphic examples I can give you. And I hope that the information from this lesson will be useful to you.